want to read a strange little story from the Old Testament about the prophet Elijah. Elijah is one of the most important people in the Old Testament, and he lived during a time of great conflict. As most of you know, God went to an oppressed little band of slaves in Egypt, and he basically broke them out of slavery, and then he led them through the desert for 40 years, and eventually they entered into the land that he had promised, the land of milk and honey, the land of Canaan, and they were able to settle down there. But the story doesn't end with, and they lived happily ever after. It never does. You know, that's always how the fairy tales end. You know, the couple gets married and they live happily ever after. No, that's just the beginning of life together, right? And when they get to the promised land, they have to make a living. And these are folks that have been wandering the desert for 40 years. They were desert nomads. As soon as they get to the promised land, they're expected to earn their living by farming. What do they know about farming? Nothing. And so no doubt what happened was they consulted with the people that had been living in the land, knew how to farm it, the Canaanites, and they said, how do we do this? And the Canaanites would have shown them what to plant and when to plant it and how to plant it. And then they would have said, now look, once you make you plant your seeds, then you make an offering to the rain god, Baal. And then Baal makes the rain to fall, and then you have enough food to eat. And that would have been a problem for the Israelites because they already had a God, the Lord God, who had brought them up out of Egypt and led them through the desert. And they said, well, we can't do that. We've already got this God. And the Canaanites would have said to them, well, your desert God sounds pretty good at being a desert God, but what does a desert God know about rain? I tell you what, maybe you should just worship them both. Worship the Lord and worship Baal. And, for hundreds of years, that's really what most of the people did. And there was this conflict. Are they going to worship Baal or are they going to worship the Lord? And you're thinking to yourself, well, that's a very interesting history story. But what does it have to do with me? I haven't made any sacrifices to any Canaanite rain gods lately, right? But just like the Israelites, you too have to earn your daily bread. And you go out and you work hard at it, just like they did. But there's an underlying question of who makes the rain to fall in your life? Who helps you to earn your daily bread? Who makes sure that you're healthy, has a job? Who controls all the things that you can't control? Who is it that you count on to provide for you? And this is a church on Sunday morning, so I'm guessing that a lot of you are going to give me the answer, probably God, right? Yeah. As in the same God that led them out of the desert. Well, that's the answer that many of them would have given God too. Well, we worship you. And God would have said, well, I tell you what, worship is not actually just what you do once a week. Worship is something that you do all the time. And in our story for this morning, what's happening is, because the people of Israel, do we trust Baal to make the rain to fall? Do we trust God? God says basically, let me show you who makes the rain to fall. And he basically says, no more rain is going to fall until I say so. And so there's this drought. And what happens to farmers when there's a drought? They die, is what happens to them, because they have no food. They starve to death. And so God withholds the rain, and he tells his prophet Elijah, he speaks through the prophet, and so everybody's mad at the prophet, the king's mad at the prophet, so the prophet has to hide from everybody. And God is busy trying to keep Elijah alive. And in this story, he's going to send Elijah here and there. And in this story, somebody is going to be asked to do something. And whether or not they do it is going to really answer the question, who do they worship? Because it's one thing to say, I worship God. God asks you to do something that shows that you worship him. That's really what he's looking for. And so as I read this story, and it's from 1 Kings chapter 17, beginning of the chapter, I want you to look for who's asked to do what and how it reveals who they worship, okay? Because God's basically going to ask us the same question. So, and actually, I included verses 2 through 4, which really aren't in this story, but I like it because it's about birds, and I like birds. All right. Then the word of the Lord came to the prophet Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide. So he's got to hide from the people because he's given them the bad news that there's this drought. Hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan, and you will drink from the brook. And I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan, and he stayed there. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Now here comes the story I really want to read you. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there'd been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. He came to the town gate, and a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her, and he asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, and he called, and please bring me a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and then die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She went away, and she did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word the Lord had spoken by Elijah. Amen. So did you hear the question? Did you hear the demand that was made there? Who was it made to? The woman, that's right. And I had a couple people say Elijah, and of course Elijah is told to do a lot of things by God in this, and that he is obedient. But ultimately the question posed, the demand posed, is to this woman. And what she asked to do. She's asked to share what she has when she doesn't have enough, and that's going to show who she worships. This story reminds me of a lot of stories in the Bible in which God basically asks people to share what they have when they don't have enough. For instance, the feeding of the 5,000, right? And the crowds are always following Jesus. Sometimes when he doesn't want to be followed, sometimes when he's trying to get away from everybody, and they follow him out to a deserted place, no town anywhere near. He teaches them for a couple of days, and then finally the disciples say, you better send these people away because they've run out of things to eat. And Jesus says to them, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And the disciples are just like, well, we've got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. There's 5,000 people here, Jesus. And Jesus says, bring what you've got. A couple of chapters later, very similar situation. The crowd again has followed Jesus off to a deserted place. Again, they're there too long. Jesus needs to let them go, but it says he called his disciples to them and he said, I have compassion for these people, for they've been with me 3 days and they've got nothing to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry or they may collapse along the way. The disciples answered, well, where are we going to get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? And Jesus says, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied. Just a few fish, nothing much, Jesus. And then Jesus basically says, bring it all to me anyway. You know, the idea that when we don't have enough, that basically he's going to ask us to share what we have, to realize that what's going on here is he's basically putting them to the test of, who do you really worship? Who do you really think makes the rain to fall? Who do you really believe God that's going to provide for you? And all of these situations had to have been terrifying for the people in them. I mean, the woman in Elijah's story has a little boy to take care of. I mean, she's on her own. There's this horrible drought. I mean, she basically says, look, I'm just going to take what little food we have left. It'll be our last meal, and then we'll just finish starving to death. And then the disciples are not in quite such a desperate situation. On the other hand, maybe they kind of were, because you're out in the middle of nowhere and you have no food. You collapse in the middle of the desert. What's going to happen to you? And Jesus says, well, I have compassion on these people. And the disciples are like, well, what about compassion on us? You're making us give what little we have left. And I mean, think about it. You're there and you've got enough for, I don't know, half of the disciples. A couple of loaves of bread among however many disciples there were. What good is it going to do to feed the 4,000 or 5,000 people? I mean, it's not going to go very far. Jesus, you're just not being practical. I mean, sharing what you have when you don't have enough is an act of courage, is it not? It's an act of faith because you're being asked to trust. And it's an act of worship. God is saying, don't you believe that I am the one who makes the rain to fall? Bring me what you have. I mean, these are dramatic stories. And you may have had a few instances in your life, and I'm sure we could get a few from the room of moments where somebody was asked to share what they had. But look, what we're talking about is not, wait for the dramatic moments. What we're talking about is an entire way of life. God is always tying together this idea of worshiping Him with bringing Him what we have and sharing with other people. I mean, they asked Jesus a couple of times, what are the 2 greatest commandments? And what does He say? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. In other words, bring God everything you've got. And then He ties it to what? Loving your neighbor as you love yourself. And He wasn't just saying have some nice, warm, fuzzy feelings for your neighbors, right? God's a lot more practical than that. And in case we don't get it, He specifically says in Matthew 25, and He gives this parable about the judging of the nations, and He ties worshiping God to sharing what we have. He says, the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And the people say, I don't remember doing any of that. And He says, when you did it to any of the least of these, you did it to me. That He's very intentionally tying worship. Who do we really worship? With sharing what we have. And, you can see from Matthew 25 that when it comes to sharing, He pretty much means sharing any and everything. Right? I mean, one of the things there is, one of the big things in the Bible is hospitality. In other words, sharing your home, sharing your land, sharing your life. with people that you don't know, maybe don't like, maybe don't trust. What does he say over and over again? He talks about being kind to the stranger or the foreigner. For you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. He talks, you look through the Matthew 25 passage, a lot of those things are about sharing your time, right? Taking care of the sick and visiting those in prison. And of course, in the Old Testament, you've got a whole thing about time in the Ten Commandments called keeping the Sabbath. And the Ten Commandments, there's, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's actually two versions of the Ten Commandments. There's one in Exodus 20 and there's one in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And they're mostly the same except for the commandment about the Sabbath, where in Exodus, he ties it to sharing your time with God, right? Rest on the seventh day to honor the Creator who created you. Share your time with God. But in Deuteronomy 5, he ties it more into sharing time with people who have no time, right? Flip through Deuteronomy 5, where he basically talks about making sure that the people who work for you, even the animals that work for you, those who are in more fragile situations, have some time to rest. You're basically asked to share, which a lot of us, we don't have enough money, but we sure as heck don't have enough time, right? But then there's also the call, and this is where, nobody wants to hear the pastor say this, but too bad, because it says it in the Bible. We're also called to share our money. And we're called to do it in at least two really kind of uncomfortable ways. One is to share it with the poor. And there are too many scriptures to go through them all. I'll just give you one from Proverbs. Those who give to the poor lack nothing, but those who close their eyes to them receive many curses. You know what he's talking about by closing your eyes to the poor, right? It's like when you're at the intersection and the beggar's wanting some money, and what do? You don't make eye contact, right? Uncomfortable laughter. You know it's true, right? Just don't make eye contact. Close your eyes, right? I love, there's another proverb which I didn't give to Harper. You have to look it up. But it basically says, to give to the poor is to lend your money to God, and he always repays. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful proverb. The other thing that he tells us to do is not only give money to the poor, share what you have with the poor, he also says to bring a tithe to the church. Give them again, we're in Deuteronomy. Be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce every year. That's, how much more terrifying do you want to get than that? Share a tenth of your paycheck off the top. And that's pretty scary to do all of these things. And, we know that it's scary, but God is always saying, look, if you worship me, bring me what you have. And that'll show me if you're really worshiping me. And we know that it's terrifying. It's terrifying for the woman in our story because Elijah says to her, don't be afraid. You don't say don't be afraid to people who aren't scared in the first place. And then, the thing of it is when we do begin to rely on him to bring, it actually takes away the fear in our lives, because most of us, no matter how much we have, are worried that we are not going to have enough. Whether we are living paycheck to paycheck or whether we got a bank account full of money, for a lot of us, there's this underlying anxiety that at some point we're going to run out. And we live in fear. And God says, look, I want to teach you. It's not just about making you worship me. I want to teach you not to live in that fear. I want you to really understand that I'm the one who makes the rain to fall and the one who provides. And so he makes this woman a promise. And he says, the jar of flour in your cupboard will not be used up. The jug of oil will not run dry until the day that the Lord sends rain. And we can say, well, that sounds good, but I still don't see how I can do this. I mean, share what I have, and I don't have enough. I don't have enough for my family. I'd love to be able to tithe to the church. I'd love to be able to give, but I've got all these debts and these bills to pay. So I'd like to speak To those who are convicted by this, those of you who, your conscience is telling you, yes, I know I need to do this, but you just don't see how to do it, 2 words. One is a practical word. The practical word is in September, on September the 9th, we are going to offer a class called Financial Peace University, which is designed to help people, give them very practical tools for how to get out of debt and how to begin to make your money work for you. How many, I won't ask, I'll tell you what, don't raise your hand, but how many of you feel like you are controlled by your money rather than you controlling your money? If you are tired of feeling controlled like a slave to your money, sign up for this class. Or look, just express interest on the connection card, and we'll get back to you, and you can tell us if you want to take the class or not. But there are a lot of people that have taken this class. How many of you have taken this class? Quite a few have taken this class, and there'll be a testimony that it really helped them to get out of debt following these practices. So that's the practical word, but I got to tell you that the more powerful word is just the word from the Lord. And the word from the Lord is that if you will bring him what you have in the fullness of worshiping him, he's not going to let you down. This passage says that, the very end of it says that, it happened just as Elijah said it would happen, that the jug of oil didn't run dry, the jar of flour didn't run empty, and that she was taken care of. And I would imagine that I could get a few dozen people in this room right now to give a testimony where when they began to trust in the Lord, they found that the Lord took care of them. Anybody in here got yeah, there are a few hands up. But what I'd like to do this morning is tell you about a miracle. Because in this story, you got a miracle, right? You got, oil that doesn't run dry. I'd like a bank account that doesn't run dry, right? No matter how much you take out, right? And just to show you that God didn't stop doing miracles when the Bible stopped being written, I'm going to share you a miracle story about God taking care of people who brought the Lord what they had and shared what they had with others. Now, there was a woman who used to be fairly well known in American churches, but she's not really that known anymore, at least among the younger generation. Her name is Corrie ten Boom. How many of you know that name? That's quite a few people, but I also see quite a few hands, or few people that are not raising their hands. Corrie ten Boom was Dutch. She lived in Amsterdam in the first part of the 20th century. She was a watchmaker, and she lived with her father, Caspar. There's Caspar ten Boom, also a watchmaker, and her sister, Betsy. And they had a shop on the first floor, and then they lived above it in an apartment on the second floor. And they were very devout Christians, and they lived this lifestyle of bringing God what they had and sharing with others. Corrie ran a little club for teenage women. It was kind of a cross between our youth group and our after-school program, where basically she took these folks in and taught them different things. And the whole family just had this reputation in the community for sharing their money, their hospitality, and their life with the community. And then in 1940, what happened in Holland? Anybody know? World War II happened, that's right. The Germans invaded Holland, occupied Holland, and began a pretty severe oppression of the people. They closed down Corrie's youth club. They began to make their Jewish neighbors wear the yellow Star of David on their clothing to mark them out as Jews. And interestingly enough, when they did that, Caspar, who was not Jewish, began to voluntarily wear a yellow Star of David on his clothing. Talk about bringing God what you have. And then when they began to deport the Jews to the death camps, once again, the Ten Booms brought what they had to God, which was their shop. And they created a hiding place within the shop so that Jewish families could stay there and hide from the Nazis. And for 4 years, they helped everybody that they could, but in 1944, they were betrayed by a Dutch informant, a neighbor. And the Gestapo, you know who the Gestapo is? The secret police, the Nazi secret police, swooped in and arrested Corrie and Betsy and Casper and some other members of the family and dragged them off to prison. And, Casper, he's 84 years old by this point. And the Nazis look at him and say, look, we have no interest in keeping you in prison, and we're going to let you go so you can die in your own bed. You just need to promise not to do this anymore. And Casper looked at them and he said, if you let me go home today, tomorrow, I will open my door to anyone who knocks looking for help. And they said, well, you can be shot for that. And he said, it would be my honor to be shot for that. He died 9 days later in the prison hospital. His daughters, Corrie and Betsy, were moved from prison to prison, camp to camp. They finally ended up in Ravensbrück, which was a labor camp and then a death camp for women in Germany. In the last year of the war, there were about 80 women were dying each day. That's about one every 15, 20 minutes in the camp from starvation, from disease, and of course from the gas chambers. And into this terrible place, Corrie and her sister Betsy were taken. And Corrie managed to smuggle in two things, a Bible and a jar of liquid vitamins. And she just kind of packed them into her dress, and how she got them in is a miracle in and of itself, because of course the guards are searching every woman as they come through, and she just prays, God help me. And all the women in front of her were searched, all the women behind her were searched, they waved her through. And with the Bible, the women held worship services each day in the barracks. And the vitamins were for Betsy, because Betsy was weaker and frailer and sicker, and she had a vitamin deficiency. But the problem was, once they got into the camp, there were 25 other women in the barracks who had the same vitamin deficiency. And Corrie's like, what do I do? I mean, she starts praying to God, what do I do? Because if I save the drops for Betsy, they'll be gone in a month. But if I give them to all the women who need them, they'll be gone today. But her father had taught her, if you worship God, you bring God what you have. She knew what she had to do. She lined up all the women that were sick, and she gave them each some of the vitamin drops. And there were enough for each of them. But then the next day, something weird happened. She lined them all up, and there were enough drops the next day. And the next day after that. And then the next day after that. And Corrie's trying to look into this dark brown glass bottle, trying to see how much is left in there, right? But every time she would tilt the bottle, more drops would fill the glass stopper. Finally, her sister Betsy said, look, do you remember that story from 1 Kings where the woman shared what she had with the prophet Elijah, and her jug of oil never ran dry? Maybe this is like that. Maybe this is a miracle. And day after day, the drops kept coming, until finally one day, another prisoner came into the barracks and said, look what I've gotten. And she had this big jar of the vitamins, which she'd managed to steal from the staff room. And that very day, Corrie's bottle ran dry. Corrie ten Boom survived Ravensbrück. She lived to be 91. You got the picture of her, and there she is. And she looked like a living saint. She lived to be 91 years old. She wrote a book. She actually became quite famous, and she wrote a book called The Hiding Place, and I would highly recommend reading that book if you have never read it, because this story and lots of other really wonderful stories are in that book. And the reason I tell you this is so that you won't think that God stopped doing miracles when the Bible was finished, that God still loves his people. He's still calling us to worship him by bringing him what we have and sharing with others. So bring God what you have. Amen.